is connect the past with the present. Because that's why we study this in the first place. It's not just to learn what happened 100 or 150 or 400 years ago or 1500 years ago. It's to understand what that has to do with who we are today and what we can learn from those situations. And there is no better circumstance for saying that history matters than the moment that we are in. To talk about a pandemic 100 years ago while we are in the midst of the pandemic, of a pandemic, is a particularly salient moment. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. Just a few words of brief introduction. You've probably heard or read a great deal about the Spanish flu in the last couple of months. The book that I wrote, More Deadly Than War, came out 2 years ago at the time of the 100th anniversary of the flu, and also the end of World War I, because you cannot discuss the flu without discussing the war, and you can't really discuss, especially the last year of the war, without talking about the flu. They are intricately connected in every way. What came to be called the Spanish flu began in the United States. The first recorded accounts took place in army bases that had been set up around the country once the United States declared war, which happened in April of 1917. Of course, the war started in August 1914. The United States stayed out of it for 3 years until April 1917, when war was declared on Germany. At that point, we had no army. We had no navy to speak of. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, put out a call for millions of soldiers to go over and fight in the killing trenches of Europe. This was partly enlistment. I want you, Uncle Sam, that was when he was born, and partly drafting. Right after war was declared, we established a new administration called the Selective Service Administration. They weren't going to call it a draft, and they weren't going to call it conscription. They came up with a nice euphemism: selective service. Oh, you've been selectively selected to serve. So the draft and enlistment started by March of 1918. There were literally hundreds of thousands of young men in army camps spread all across the country. In some of those camps, the first round of a very, very virulent flu started to hit the young soldiers who were in the camps. They were knocked flat on their backs. Some of them were gasping for air, literally choking for air. And because they weren't getting enough oxygen, they were turning blue, a medical condition called cyanosis. And they were sometimes dying right on the spot. Doctors could not believe what they were seeing. In fact, the fact they were turning blue led to the first name of this disease, which was the Purple Death. Before that was called the Spanish flu, a lot of people called it the Purple Death. One doctor in New York City, in fact, later reports that hundreds of people are streaming in. He said they're all blue as huckleberries and spitting blood, because that's what they were doing. Blood was coming from people's ears, eyes, noses, mouths in some cases. So this was a really grotesque and violent sickness, and very often a violent death. It was sudden, it was contagious, and the bodies started to pile up. Those young men in those army camps, and it started to spread around the army camps because people were going back and forth between the camps, then got onto crowded trains. Then they got onto crowded troop ships, and they went to Europe. 1 million doughboys, American soldiers, landed in France by May of 1918, many of them infected with influenza, and it then exploded on the continent. This was the first very, very deadly phase of what became the Spanish flu. This is a good point to explain why it's called the Spanish flu. It did not start in Spain. It did not originate there. Spain was a neutral nation in the war, non-combatant. It did not censor its newspapers, unlike the other warring nations. So the first published report of an outbreak of disease in Europe comes out of Madrid, where the streetcars are shut down and the king gets sick. That's picked up by a British newspaper, and henceforward it would be called, at least in the English-speaking world, the Spanish flu. In Spain, it was called the Naples soldier. The Germans called it the Russian pest. The Russians called it the Chinese fever. So we can see this playing out again today as we give different names to diseases. Now, this had an impact on the war itself, on the conduct of the war. The German army was trying to mount an offensive. They had 500,000 soldiers sick. They were unable to mount an offensive in the spring of 1918 that they hoped would push the British and the French back before the Americans arrived. So it did have an impact on the war. At one point, the British fleet could not sail. It did slack off. Important to remember that as well when we talk about parallels between then and now. It slacked off and then returned in a second wave in September of 1918. It came back more virulent, more violent, more lethal, if anything. And this was when the real deadly aspect of the Spanish flu struck America on the civilian level. Very famously, I've written about this, there was a Liberty Loan Parade. Again, the connection to the war is very powerful. In Philadelphia, 200,000 people crowd into the streets on September 28th. They know that there's virus around. They know that there's flu in the military bases, but the health department allows this parade to go on. Within 2 days of that parade, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. About 15,000 people died in a matter of weeks. The undertakers couldn't keep up with the demand. There were no coffins for all the bodies. People said the bodies are stacked like cordwood. This was the extraordinary moment in American history when people are dying in extraordinary numbers. And just to give you those numbers, 675,000 Americans, it's estimated, died in about a year's time from the Spanish flu and complications. That is more than all the men who died fighting in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and Korea put together. So this was an extraordinary moment in American history. The population, by the way, was about a third of what it is today. So if you just want to do some simple math and multiply 700,000 times 3, we'd be getting close in the realm of 2 million people dying from the flu, again, in a very short space of time. So there was no city or town, no family that went unaffected by this. It was an extraordinary moment. The war ends, of course, on November 11th, 1918. The flu continues. Very bad second wave in the fall. It's followed a drop-off, and then another wave comes back in the winter of 1919. One of the victims in 1919 was Woodrow Wilson, who was negotiating the Paris Peace Treaty, what became known as the Versailles Treaty, that ended the war. Wilson was so sick, his doctor thought he had been poisoned, and there were people who wanted to get rid of Wilson, so it was a believable idea, but it was the flu. And there's a suggestion that Wilson's flu really affected him. It affected his resolve, his judgment, his willpower, perhaps his reasoning, and that he did things that he said he was not going to do before he went to Versailles. Again, that's a little bit of speculation, but interesting to see how this disease might have had an impact on history. And that's one of the real big stories here as well. We tend to talk about history and we teach dates and battles and speeches and causes and pieces of treaty, and we leave out this human piece of the story. But you cannot talk about the war, and especially the last year of the war, without discussing this extraordinary loss of life. 50 to 100 million people dead around the world, the most deadly epidemic in modern history, and the most deadly epidemic in history to get totally since the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. Then it kind of got left out of the history books, which is one of the reasons it's so fascinating, and one of the reasons I called it the hidden history of the Spanish flu. People did not want to talk about it. People did not want to write about it. It was not something that you learned about in school for the next 40 or 50 years when they taught you about World War I. So that's an interesting piece of the story as well. Now, I can tell you that Maine was hit very hard. I can tell you that because Maine was not far from one of the real hotspots of the Spanish flu, which was Boston in 1918. It was the first city that got took the first hit from the second wave in September, especially at a army base just outside of Boston known as Camp Devens. And a lot of people from Maine had sons in Camp Devens. And like all worried parents, they heard their kids were sick and they rushed down there to take care of them. In the process, getting sick and bringing that back. Bath, Portland, big hits to both of those cities. Bath, of course, a naval shipping yard and the construction of naval vessels. Anywhere there was military activity going on became a focus of what was happening, but then it soon spread into the civilian population. So you have all the debates in 1918 in Maine that we're having today. Should we close churches? Should we shut everything down? Should we do the social distancing? They did call it that. They didn't have flattened the curve back then, but they did all these things and debated all these things very hotly. Perhaps no subject was more important than should we close the churches down. And that really got a lot of pushback in a very different time in America when we were a much more of a church-going nation. So interesting to see how the sociology of this was similar and different in some respects. Maine sent nurses down to Boston. Many of them got sick. Maine sent nurses to Camp Devens. Many of them got sick and died. The Italian immigrants who were in places like Waterville, building the railroads, living in tenements, tremendous impact on those people as well. This was something that certainly hit poorer people worse than it hit the wealthy and the well-to-do. No different from today in many respects. So a lot of similarities between 1918 and today. There are three principal lessons I would like to draw from this, and then I'd like to move on to your questions, and I'm already talking more than I should have. First is the importance in 1918 of lies, censorship, and propaganda. They all played a role in allowing the flu to spread. There were outright lies from people in government about the existence of the flu. They wanted to keep people from panicking. They wanted to make sure that people were going off to the factories and that the kids were going to still go to the camps and enlist to fight in the war. So there was deliberate attempt to censor and even lie about the vaccine. Part of the propaganda was blaming it on the Germans. In Bath, in Bar Harbor, the newspaper said, could this be a new German weapon? They actually believed that the Germans were responsible, that they maybe poisoned the water supplies, or in another case, had Bayer, a German company, tainted aspirin, the wonder drug of the 20th century developed by Bayer. So those things were all in the air at the time. The second thing that's really important, I think, to look back at and learn from is the sense that science was ignored. Certainly in Philadelphia, the health department ignored the advice to not allow this parade to go on. Woodrow Wilson, the president, and Jack Pershing, the head of the expeditionary force, were told by the army doctors not to bring any more men over. Putting men on these ships was spreading the disease. They were only interested in winning the war and the war effort, so they kept pushing soldiers across the ocean on what became floating coffins. And finally, and it relates to that, is the sense of misplaced priorities. The priority for Woodrow Wilson was winning the war. The priority for Philadelphia to have this big parade was meeting its quota of selling war bonds, Liberty loans. So these were economic and political and military concerns that outweighed public health. And we're having that debate right now. So I think it's a really interesting lesson to look back at what happened then, what happened today. Some cities were much more successful than others in preventing tremendous loss. St. Louis and San Francisco were both had very effective quarantine and masking, and we can talk about masks some more. Both of them, however, relaxed too soon, and they saw big spikes of infections and deaths after relaxing their quarantine measures. So again, very important lessons that we can learn from 100 years ago. And on that, I'm going to catch my breath and maybe take some questions from you, Joe.
We do have one question that might give you an opportunity to kind of just build on a little bit where you ended. Aaron Kate's saying, I'm looking to make connections to coronavirus and what's happening for students to draw upon modern day connections. And I think your kind of 3 points there at the end kind of hit on that. So I don't know if that's something you wanted to speak to more because of that question. Hold on, I gotta find you again. There you go.
Okay, I'm unmuted. My wife would probably like that button. The fact is that there are a lot of parallels and a lot of things that we can look back on. I should first of all say there are a lot of differences too. When I wrote this book 2 years ago, everybody asked me, can this happen again? And I said, of course it can happen again. I didn't foresee it happening again quickly and the way it's played out. But certainly an awful lot of people have been worried about the return of pandemic virus or some other disease. That's why Ebola really scared a lot of people a few years ago. And we erected some very, very profound international guardrails to help protect not only the United States, but people around the world from another pandemic. Unfortunately, some of those guardrails have been lowered in the past few years, and that's something else we can talk about. But there are some key differences that we should start off with first. 100 years ago, they didn't know what a virus was. They had never seen a virus. Viruses are infinitely smaller than bacteria, which had been seen. So these doctors, with the tools that they had, the microscopes of the day, were looking for a bacterial infection, and it just wasn't there. They were trying to come up with a vaccine that was a bacterial-based vaccine, and it had no use. They couldn't fight a virus that they couldn't see, and that's one of the most important things we understand now. We know what viruses are. We even know what the Spanish flu virus was. Spanish flu was flu. It was an influenza virus. What we are living with now is called coronavirus, a different type of virus, a virus nonetheless, and a very, very dangerous one. It does not seem to be right now as lethal and as sudden a killer as the Spanish flu was. The other big difference, and I'm careful, a little bit careful about saying anything too medically here about the current virus, but in 1918, I can say with certainty, what was unusual is that this flu was killing otherwise healthy young people, soldiers going into the camps, nurses, young women who were becoming nurses, doctors were falling very, very quickly. It did not kill the very old and the very young as flu typically does. It's one of the interesting aspects of the Spanish flu. But there are some other things that we can say are similar. First of all, the way you control it in 1918 is exactly the way you can control it today. Hand washing. For 2 years, I've been telling kids when I go around school to talk about this book, I would end every lecture with 2 words, hand washing. It was true then, it's true today. Masking, we're having this debate, and we've been playing this debate out in this country. Masks were the iconic image of the Spanish flu. You can see from the book, these are 2 newsboys wearing masks. The typical mask of 1918 was made from gauze. Gauze, of course, is not very thick, has a lot of holes in it, not very effective for keeping out virus. Also, people were supposed to clean them. You were supposed to use them very carefully, and most people did not do that. So the flu mask in 1918, for the most part, was a very ineffective means of controlling the virus. Much better, as we still know today, for keeping an infected person from infecting other people rather than preventing you from getting infected. So that's one of the things that was true then and somewhat true today. The response of certain cities, I think, is a straw. I mentioned it briefly, but let me go into it a little bit more. We're having this debate right now about reopening the economy, opening up cities. What makes sense? This is a really important and old debate that goes far beyond this particular outbreak and this particular pandemic, and really gets to what a society values most. In 1918, the most important thing was, to the government at least, was continuing the fight against the Germans, continuing to send people into factories, continuing to train troops and putting them on ships and taking them overseas. So I think for students today, the parallels between the two things are pretty easy to see. And we've also had, the last thing I mentioned earlier was also this sense of ignoring science. This is also a much bigger issue to me than this crisis alone, because we are working under an administration and living under an administration that has been really ignoring science. There's really no other way to code it. Whether it's in environmental questions, questions of air, water, all of those things, and certainly the question of climate change, which is, in the background here. We're focused on this crisis, but we do still have the enormous crisis of climate change, which this administration has chosen to essentially ignore. So I think that those are really important issues that go beyond the crisis that we're in, but certainly affect it. We should really be listening to the best scientists and the best science that we have at any given moment. And I don't think that has been the case. There's a really wonderful article in the current New Yorker magazine, which is about why Seattle did so well in controlling this as opposed to New York. And it really walks through the different things that Seattle and Washington State did to tamp down and flatten the curve very early on. And they were fortunate to have had somebody who was trained in the CDC, and there's an epidemiological investigation service, and he had been trained in that. And so as soon as he saw this first case, he said, not immediately, but he told the mayor, and then the governor, that they were going to have to soon move towards shutting things down, which they did. A real forward-thinking approach that was led by science, and in which the scientists became the spokespeople. That's certainly not what is happening today with these press briefings that we're getting from the administration's task force, where the voice of science is not the first and most important voice that you hear. So that's some overall general depictions of how we should have learned some lessons from 100 years ago and how they may or may not be applied today.
Okay, now I'm trying to get ahead of the game. I'm knowing I'm going to have to unmute you here in a second, Ken. There's a question about, and I lost the question. Any idea where, like, the current stage of COVID-19, is there a comparable stage to the Spanish flu of 1918, kind of in terms of where we're at now and what that looked like then?
Yes, I'm unmuted. That's a really good question and a little bit harder to answer. I think that the timing in many ways is similar, because the Spanish flu, as I mentioned earlier, really began in February, March of 1918, very similar to what we're seeing having happened with COVID-19, although they keep kind of pushing back the date of when this appeared. And I know a lot of people are asking, was it here much earlier than we thought? And that's a scientific question that remains to be answered. So again, I'm trying to be very careful about the scientific medical aspects of this current crisis, because I am not a doctor or a medical expert in any respect. I'm really speaking this from a historical basis. The Spanish flu, when it made its first appearance, was typical of flu season in the United States. February, March, April, it accelerated, started to slack off. It was around other parts of the world at that time, but many people thought, well, this is the flu, and it will be over with flu season. It was also much less lethal in that first phase. It was killing a lot of people, but not quite as violently or virulently as it would later on. So that is another important lesson, and where nobody knows if this COVID is going to make a resurface in September. Dr. Fauci was warning about it, exactly that, the other day, and said, we don't know, but he expects it to. The difference of what happened in 1918, and we can't say what will happen in September of 2020. In 1918, the virus came back, and it seems to have mutated to some degree. So what happens when something mutates is that it can become more violent and virulent, or it could become less violent. And this one became more virulent. And it also mutated enough so that some people who might have been exposed to it in the springtime, and developed what we call that herd immunity, so that you might get a little touch of it and then not get it again, that did not seem to apply to Spanish flu. That it had mutated enough sufficiently by the following fall that it was almost like a different and new disease, and many, many people got it. The infection rate was very high, and the contagion level was very high. So it's, again, no one can predict what will happen in terms of this virus and its impact come fall. I can only hope that we will not have a repeat of what happened in 1918, because as I've been saying, it was much worse in the fall than it was in the springtime. And I'd hate to have that be the historic parallel that comes true again. But we should be very, very cognizant that this is not something that just goes away in April or May with the summertime coming, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't think that the history suggests that, and most scientists that I'm reading about this don't suggest it either.
Ken, Wendy wants to know, and this is the last question I currently have in the hopper, so if you've got some other questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box. Wendy wants to know, do you know if